Good afternoon. I'm Jessica Morgan, the director of DEAR. Wonderful to see so many people here today. Thank you so much for coming. It's my great pleasure to be in conversation with Bob Irwin today. I hope all of you have had a chance already to see the installation. Of course, you're actually sitting within Bob's work as well. The building was a great part of his contribution to DEAR and the gardens. So if you haven't had the time yet, I do hope that after the talk, you will spend some time walking through the galleries, admiring the major project that Bob's undertaken here at DEAR and the gardens as well. It's an extraordinary contribution to DEAR, and we're incredibly proud to be able to say that Bob's been infiltrating every aspect of DEAR Beacon. Before we start, the installation, Excursus, Homage to the Square, was a project, Cubed, sorry, was a project that involved many people's work. I would say that it's really unfolded over years, and the last few months especially were very intense with many people involved. So many that I had to write down all their names. So if you don't mind, I'm going to shout them out because it was an amazing project. So Jim Schauffele, who's our head of operations here at DEAR, was of course leading the team who've worked on this project and worked very closely with Bob on the building as well. Curtis Harvey, Kurt Diebel, Chad Bowen, John Patrick Murphy, Jerry Shakespeare, Joey Huppert, who's Bob's right-hand man and leading the studio now for many years, Jeff Jameson, Anna Irwin, Heidi Gennati, Matthew Held, Kirsten Moshe, Michael Strong, and Kelly Kivland, who's from our curatorial team. So congratulations to all of them. It was really a labor of love. I know they did an extraordinary job, and I know that you can see every detail that's been worked through with that installation. So Bob's work, Bob, of course, has joined us from San Diego. He began his life in Long Beach, California, and started as a painter, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with the work from the early years in the 1960s, now many decades of production. Having abandoned painting, he moved towards a practice that occupies space and encourages an experiential relationship with the work that I think was truly radical and still is. I'm happy to say, I think you can see here today that Bob has not let up at all in his inquiry. I think the questions that he asks are still utterly relevant to artistic practice, and I'm sure that's why we've got lots of young artists who are here today. His work, of course, is extended beyond the museum, the institution, into the environment. He's made many projects in urban space, in outdoor space, whether it's a garden such as here, or of course at the Getty Center, or the wonderful Palm Project that's at LACMA in California. He's worked on projects that have occupied complex urban areas, and he's even undertaken something as complex as trying to reconfigure the Miami International Airport, something that I hope we can talk about a bit in a moment, Bob. So there's no lack of ambition. I think Bob's first architectural project, and again, I hope we can touch on this, was DEAR Beacon. It was the first project that really involved actualizing an architectural space, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. I know that he's got another project of similar ambition for Chinati that will be opening next year, so we're all excited and anticipate seeing. I think we just lost sound. There we go.
Mine doesn't work?
It's back on, yeah. Bob asked that we don't talk too much about the piece that you've seen already, I hope, that we talk around it and about his practice and probably about Beacon and about the building here. I think it's important that you experience the work, but I think that everything that we talk about will probably be applicable to the piece that we've just opened. We're going to see if we decide to have question and answer at the end, right?
Yeah, that doesn't work out too well for me.
Bob did say, but I think he might take this back, but we'll see how it goes. Possibly he might be available.
Over the years, I visited a lot of universities. I said I'd go anywhere, any time for anybody. That's when I didn't have any work. I was looking for work and couldn't get any. And so I started doing it. It became a kind of odyssey. I've now been in every state of the union except 2. And in that process, I found out that question and answer was very unsuccessful. So what I would say is that which I can't do here, but as at the end of it, I'd say that I'll be on a corner or in a room someplace tomorrow at 10 and stay there as long as anybody wants to. It gives you a little time to think about the kind of question and find out whether you're really interested. It's much more satisfactory.
So maybe the bagel shop at 8:30 on Main Street, right?
Well, that's been one of the really amazing things of coming back here is that when I first came, I don't know how long ago, have you any idea? Jim?
Probably 2001, was it, Jim?
Something like that. This was a town that was three quarters boarded up, and it was very sad. They made a film here, in fact, because it was such a mean city. I forgot who it was, but to see it like not only unboarded up, but what a nice town it is. I mean, a real family place. I mean, people have come, bakeries. They made a really not a Trotsky, tourist town or anything. Outside of Beacon, it looks like a really nice place to live now, and I feel like I had a little bit to do with that, because Beacon has obviously become a pretty good-sized success, way beyond what any of us imagined. I think that the person who was really the architect for planning it was Michael Govan, who was the director of DIA, and he had a problem. The previous Heiner Friedrich, the previous semi-director, I guess. I'm not quite sure what Heiner did, but had amassed quite a collection, as you know, and but has been added onto. But he had a dilemma: was what do you do with all this material? Do we just leave it in storage? I mean, some kind of responsibility. Actually, Modern had the same problem years earlier, where they had worked as the Modern and functioned in a kind of interactive way with the community of artists. It was spectacular in New York. And they, at one point, looked around and realized they had this tremendous collection and that it was not being shown. And so they had the question, what do we do? And so they started being, in a sense, the collection, and they haven't been the Modern since. They've become it's a beautiful collection, a great place to go, but the degree of interactiveness that they exhibit now compared to what they were in their heyday is minimal. But Michael decided the great idea was to go just somewhere just out of town within reach, as you know, and that was find a home, that was a responsibility that he needed to take care of. And he found this old box factory, Nabisco box factory, which was quite a nice building, but without a budget of any size, it took a little doing to turn it from being a box factory that had been closed for a long time into what you're seeing here now. But it was an amazing kind of challenge, and an amazing fun thing to do.
Bob, can you describe a bit that process? I mean, you had worked on the major planning project for the airport. I mean, you'd been thinking about spaces and the way that we navigate them. When you approached the building here at Beacon, were you applying the same interest in movement and space, or was it really about placing artworks? Well, how did you approach it?
It sounds like, in a sense, more formal than I had. Basically, I was looking for work all the time. I wanted to do things, but I was in many ways untested, and the kind of things that I was interested in are not the kind of things that artists get. As she said, I've worked on the Miami International Airport. That was like going back to getting a PhD. They didn't ask me. In fact, they didn't want me. The city had a contract that asked that they be able to put some art in the airport. And so, and the airport said, no, just give us the money, we'll take care of it. And so in the beginning, they didn't even want a dialogue. So I forced my way in, pushed it open, and wouldn't leave. But it was, an amazing challenge. The place was a complete mess. They used to have articles every day in the paper about how people got lost and how they couldn't find their car and how they couldn't find the gate and they'd be late for a plane. It had grown up like Topsy over a period of years. They actually had runways, gates that you still walked out to see the airplane, then the gates from the 30s and then the 40s and then the 50s. So it was kind of a hodgepodge of no real rhyme or reason to it. So it was an amazing challenge. For example, you had absolutely no idea how to get there or where you were going to go when you came. And the signs were marvelously confused, and their assumption about the role of the artist was confused in the sense that you're in a rental car, you're going 40 miles an hour, you're trying to get there to the airport to dump the car off and get to your gate, and there's a sign that says airport, to the right. So you head to the right, but intuitively you happen to notice that the airport's over there. So there's a moment of, is this really true? And then right there at that moment is flight. Something, the art contribution, something about flight and that, which is exactly the one thing you don't need at that moment. Because you're trying to go across 3 lanes, as it were, to make your way to where the turn is at the top. So it added that kind of, and then at the top you realize there's a very nice, beautiful bosque of trees, which of course now doesn't let you see whether or not the road actually goes around behind it, ill-placed. And then, of course, by the time you get to the garage, you are in no man's land. And then the trip over so the point was total confusion. It was an incredibly interesting, I took on the entire airport, and they were not interested in the beginning, but I just insisted and just kept showing up every day and presenting them with plans. And I reconfigured that whole road space, redid the garages, redid all the arrival areas, all the parking areas, the concourses, the entire rationale for the airport. One of the other things that was a problem is that when you arrived at the Miami airport, you could be in Cleveland because it didn't look like every other port, or maybe even less. Had no identity. And Miami, of course, is a very richly populated town in terms of the kind of things. They have, gardens for plant gardens and bird gardens and animal gardens and all kinds of, and so all these people had little brochures that they would put up to try and get a notice or to get a few people to come in. So first thing I did was to start contacting all these people and ask whether or not they wanted a place in the airport. So as to begin to change in the sense that you would actually, halfway through the concourse, there would be a small bird aviary, and they were willing to do all the ornithology and do all the plant material and pay for the whole thing and that. So it became that intrigued the airport a little bit, a kind of freebie in which each concourse started to be identified by a different kind of event as such. And anyway, so did the really wonderful thing until after about 3, almost 4 years, Miami had just gone through a change from the Cuban revolutionaries that were coming in, changing the city. There was white flight. Everybody split to the suburbs. And the first Cuban mayor came in, and he looked around at everything in the city and realized that they were broke. And everything was broke. There was no money coming in except for one thing. The man who ran the airport, Dick Judy, he ran it brilliantly in terms of the economics. He floated all of his own bonds. He essentially made all of his own decisions. So I had, in a sense, someone who actually had, by that point, was interested in the games I was playing and the proposals I was making. But then the mayor said, from this point on, everything that goes on at the airport goes through me, which meant Dick Judy no longer ran his own ship, and that was the end of the project.
Tragic. So, Bob, I mean, you refer to this term conditional work and conditional sites, and obviously that's really what you were creating in Miami. So when you came to Beacon and encountered a town that, as you described it, was very depressed, to what extent were you thinking about the project here that you were working on with Michael in relation to the town, in relation to, obviously, the landscape, as we well know, but how far afield did you think about this?
I started out essentially looking and thinking about how and what it's like to come here. 90% of you from New York, and the rest of them coming through New York, and started thinking about, well, first we have to come and look at the building. The building was a box factory. It was a cookie cutter building, that is, it built 4 of them, and so the orientation of the building was to the north, that is, the skylights facing north, which meant that what was all the facade of the building, all the good brick, all the fenestration in that is actually up against the hill, and so the first thing was how to turn the building all the way around, make the entrance where it was, but that also was a challenge because you're since coming through a parking lot, which is the bane of every architectural project. It's just not the nicest way to enter in. So I started thinking. Also, Michael had this idea that he wanted you to enter directly into the building, not through he didn't want a bookstore or a food place, and that had to be someplace else, but he wanted you to go directly in. So at first you had this bad side of the building in a parking lot. So I started a kind of almost fantasy in my head, but I think in a sense it's true as to how this thing is that one of the things about New Yorkers, especially back then and even now to some degree, that most or a lot of them don't ever leave New York. They don't have a summer home or that sort of thing, and so going out of New York is an unusual thing to do. So I started really in my mind that the entrance to DIA was Grand Central Station, which is a great space, beautiful place to go, and a great kind of experience as a takeoff place. You get on the train, and you watch the city slowly dissolve on the way up here, which is up for a kind of catharsis for somebody who never goes out of the city, to watch it just come unravel. You're going up through Harlem, and as it were, and then the smaller ones, and then the river comes in on the side of the canal, and you begin to sense the river, and then finally you're alongside of the Hudson River, and it's a lovely ride. It's actually a great ride, and during that period, someone from New York has a kind of begin to get into a different state of mind, as it were. And then at the end, you arrive here at this station, the small station. You get out, and there's this very scenic little harbor and this very scenic view of I'm not going to talk about all the events on the way up, but you have that a great moment there, and you have a 7-minute walk to DIA, which is exactly right. Because you need to stretch, you need to get out. There's a real nice sense of having arrived now, but at the same time, you're not there. So you walk up, and then you arrive at the top of the hill, which now sets up everything. There's a great moment of arrival to look on this building down, as it were. So the idea that turning the entire parking lot into an orchard of sorts was a nice idea. And so that you enter down and then up that middle aisle, which is a third, or fourth, fifth moment of the sequence of entering. And then you arrive at this. Michael wanted you to go directly into the building, as I said. And so you have this, what is now a forecourt. The building was the large building here with where the food area and that all is on one, but you have nothing on this side. So we played with a number of ideas. And I came up finally with the idea of the bosque of trees, where you have a place to sit and look out which, by the way, we just talked about maybe taking a few trees out so that you could see the Hudson River again. But another nice place to be. You're in the country now, and to have that court be the actual entrance to the place rather than a lobby. But the one key thing there is that you're now outdoors, you're in the sunlight, the sky is high and what have you. So the main thing then was to bring you down to a scale in which that little building I built there has only indirect light. There are no lights in there. It has a scale that, in a sense, brings you down to a certain level. So you walk through those two doors, boom. It's a good moment. And you really feel like you've arrived someplace. That something is, this is a nice place to be. One of the biggest things was that the fenestration, as I said, was on one side. So I had to add the windows on both sides of the posts and that whatever, give it some character. But also when you enter at that moment, you also can see all the way through the entire building. And there's a window at the back, which is south, which is fortunate. So therefore, it's the brightest moment in there. So you actually have that. And then there's the split door thing so that you have to make a decision. There's two ways to go through a museum. One, in a sense, be taken on a trip in which you are guided all the way through. And the other one is, for a lot of people, they'd much rather make decisions. So you have to make your decision at that moment, whether to go left and to go right. I was, in a sense, of my opinion that one side would be more about sculpture and the other side would be more about painting. Also, there's this idea of getting some circulation so that you don't have to backtrack through it. But I won't go on and on and on. But the whole it was that. It was like hands-on, paying attention to what's actually happening, what's like to be in that space. So when you walk in that moment in that bright light, it's a beautiful place.
I don't know if people are aware, Bob, but you moved here. I mean, you were living here for quite a period of time.
Well, I also didn't know that the board, Michael asked me to work on the project. And so he presented me to the board, and they said, hell no, we don't want an artist. We want a real architect. So basically, they didn't hire me. But I moved up here on my own, paid my way, and, acted as if I had an invitation. But also have to add to it, there are two other people, Michael and where is he? Jim Sheffley. We were like a tandem in a way. You had Michael, in a sense, who masterminding the thing, who's really, in a sense, not like any other so-called, he's sort of like the client, but he's not, because you don't have to hide anything from him. You don't have to introduce things carefully to him. You don't have to let him get involved and say, oh, I like this, and I won't let go of it as the planning changes. But he was a resource. He had more ideas and more interest. He and a woman named Lynn Cook, who was his curator, who was the two of them were the best resource you could ever have, somebody to kick around. Jim, on the other hand, became the logician for the entire thing and made life really simple. And by the way, at this point, actually, it's Jim's museum. I mean, Jim is like every tree, everything that's successful here, he takes care of it with loving hands. So it has that kind of care, Also then, of course, having been here, I'll go back just for a minute, but having been here at the beginning, the town was 3/4 boarded up. Everything in little towns on the river had by degrees gentrified or improved or became better places to be. You jumped right over Beacon to even Fishkill, which is almost like a ghetto in a industrial sense of the word, but a drop off from the highway, and then on up to the big estates further up. But Beacon had been just completely abandoned. Years and years ago, it was like the hat capital of the world. This was a kind of and it's called Beacon because that mountain, that was the place where they actually signaled the Americans where the British were as they were fighting up and down the river. It had a nice history. It had a potential to be. It's the most nice thing for me now is to come back, and it's a nice town, but it's not Chotsky's or that sort of thing. Despite the DA being here, they're real restaurants and they're really bakeries, and the people here come to live here with their kids. It's a nice place, and to have an effect on that is now really a great joy for me. But they didn't want me in the beginning. The artists didn't want me.
I was going to say,
Richard,
Bob,
Sarah.
Yeah. Can you talk a bit about being involved with? I mean, you've touched on this and the idea for seeing the building as a pathway that was the choice of the viewer. I mean, I think all the things that you're describing, of course, is so much part of your work, which is why I think it's as relevant to talk about all of this work that went into the building as it is to talk about the installation we just opened. But perhaps you can talk a bit about the way in which you and Michael and Lynn were working together to think about the encounter with art, the experience. I mean, this aspect that's been so important within your own thinking about your own work.
What do you mean, my own work? This was my work.
This is your work,
This is what I was doing.
Yeah.
One of the big things
But then it had other work in it, which was perhaps a difference.
Of course, and it needs to, in a sense, be appropriate for all the other work in it. Like I was saying, Sarah, he had the idea that I would be inside. I would be my work, and he would be inside of it, which, of course, no artist would be interested in that. And that's, by the way, what every museum almost is. The architect can't resist having, in a sense, making a work of art or a work of architecture, at least to some degree. Some more egregious than others. I just saw, the guy who does Denver. What?
Not Gary. Liebeskind, yes. Liebeskind, yeah.
One of the rottenest buildings you've ever been in your life. I mean, the guy actually was of the opinion that there was no need for art in it. He was going to make them a brilliant building and experience of art, and his thing is absolutely, you can't believe it. But to some degree, there's a little bit of that in building any museum. I mean, of course, an architect wants to for it to have some identity and what have you, which is not to be unexpected. But at the same time, by degrees, people have built some rotten museums over the last few years. The windows here don't seem like much, but they were the one gesture, I think, that probably turned this thing from being a factory into a little more refined space. Very simple kind of thing. The alternating 4 open planes as opposed to the frosted ones around it has developed a little bit of elegancy. It harked back to Art Deco. They almost have a somewhat Art Deco look to them, but it was functional at the beginning. The 4 white ones is how they had air conditioning for the place. So it didn't have to change anything other than we had to reglaze the window anyway, was just to make the 4 glasses, which helps in the sense that if they're all glazed, you feel sort of locked in. If they're all open, you fall out. So kind of, a relationship between the two, and in balance, I think improved the thing really well, and gave it a certain elegance. I could go on for
Bob, could you talk
forever because there's a million details, but
do you feel obviously works have come and gone, some of the galleries have changed. I mean, when you began this project, did you feel strongly that everything should remain precisely as it was set at that moment?
No, just the opposite. It's the biggest thing was once you've solved the issues of how one flows through here, how one goes from back to front, how you don't, in a sense, repeat yourself unnecessarily or unnecessarily. It's, in a sense, a really a very open space. I mean, it'll take on all kinds of activity. The collection, which has expanded over the period of years, I mean, you can't beat it. It's one of the best museums in the world, if I say so myself. because my hand's not there. Like Richard Serra, of course, would be the classic example. That's one of the best places for a Richard Serra you'll ever see. It was a railroad siding where the train came in to unload. So it has that power, that masculinity to it. We had to refine it in some ways, but Serra looks great in there. In fact, he never even pissed, or moaned. He just put it in there, which is pretty amazing. I'm going through the thing because essentially that's what I do, and this was an incredible opportunity for me, not to be missed. Of course, at the end of it, they wanted to congratulate the architect, and they didn't have one. Anyway, so
did you when you were working on this building, Bob? I was wondering if you knowing the questions that you ask yourself and your own writing, which I think touches on this, but were you thinking about the purpose of museums? What is the need for them, the aesthetic need, the public need, given that the town was quite barren at that time, were you thinking about who the public were and what this would be providing and what change it might bring about?
Well, I don't think anybody could have predicted the success of this place or the idea that it would have as wide an audience as it has, that people come from Europe and Japan and what have you, that it has an amazing, that was not even in the cards. You were just trying to find a really good home for the collection that they had, and find there was a lot of art that you knew what the character was and the kind of space that it needed, the kind of light that it needed. For example, once you do the Serra over there, now all of a sudden you have a dark side of the museum, and you have a lot of Joseph Beuys, perfect spot for Joseph Beuys. He needs a kind of a dark, meaty kind of space also, and you have the other side of the museum where you have the, what's his name, with the holes in the ground?
Heiser. Michael Heiser.
One of the best Heisers he's ever made. It's a great one, I think what's his name with the drawings on the wall?
Solowitz.
Oh, man, the best Solowitz you'll ever see. But for him to have that kind of space, that much space, that kind of, it's like heaven. It really is. A great artist, and an opportunity to exercise without any other outside of responsibilities, but to do just what his work does. Mm-hmm. The Chamberlains, the chance of having the best of Dan Flavin. The Tatlin series doesn't get any better. I love that thing. It's really good. It's one of the best stuff he's ever done. It is. The place is filled with that kind of stuff. I get a little sentimental. At 86, all of a sudden, I'm going into my cups, man. It's never used to be that touchy. Can't talk anymore. I was used to be mean. So where do you want to go from
maybe
here?
We can. It's not quite the piece that it is now, but I'd love to hear you talk a bit about the first iteration of the installation that opened in Chelsea, because I'm sure many of you know, but this was a project that was begun in Dear Chelsea in the late 1990s, 98, and it was a work that developed over time. You also changed it while it was in the galleries in Dear Chelsea on 22nd Street. And obviously it had to be very much reconfigured and rethought. That's what I was referring to over the...
Oh, you mean to bring it out here?
The many years that you worked on thinking about it for Dear Beacon. Very different conditions. Chelsea had windows. It was a warehouse space with windows, of course, around the edge. But you still feel it's got the same title. It's the same work. I just would like to hear about that process.
Basically, Michael asked me, gave me the opportunity to take that floor and do that. And again, it was one of those things that you couldn't beat me off as a stick. I was looking for work, and it sort of, it grew up like Topsy over a period of time. And I had talked in my writing and what I talked a lot about the idea of a sentient being as a vis-a-vis a cognitive self, and that one of the really key elements in that debate was how one approaches anything in the world, whether you essentially first run your hands over it or you run your mind over it, which is one of the reasons I'm not going to talk about the piece, because that would just clutter up the possibility of seeing it. But in looking at that opportunity, I did it. I divided it up, doing the things I was, and putting the lights in that way. And I had no idea. I kept feeling really both interested but not sure about. There was something that I wasn't sure about what was going on there. When you left, you couldn't really take it with you. It was not. You had to go back again and go back again. And I suddenly realized that after shooting my mouth off for years about the idea of a non-hierarchical space, that how one approaches that, the idea of no beginning, no middle, no end, and no charted way to proceed through it, no intellectual rationale for the what and the why of it, but rather in a sense that every choice you make, you have to make at that moment. You have at every point you've got at least 3 or 4 choices, and each one is really made tactily. There's no rhyme or reason intellectually to go this way or that way. And you can enter at any point, you can leave at any point. So I'd made a complete non-hierarchical space. What I liked about it was that I'd done it after shooting my mouth off all those years. I had done it without actually knowing I'd done it. I had become it, which was very satisfying. And suddenly it's the way I looked at things, the way I saw. That's why to talk about it now or to explain it now and that is ridiculous. Now, I'm a little nervous about this because I've never done this before, where I repeated a thing. And is it as good or is it okay? I don't know at the moment. I am still scratching my ass about that one. And I'm not sure whether or not it was the best idea in the world, but somehow doing it here was worth revisiting this, so I did it. We'll let the chips fall where they may. I'll let you guys make up your own mind whether it's one thing that has changed, which a lot is I was a painter and I've done gardens and that, and these are very different palettes. And they have all different kinds of properties. And the use of color, of course, is a radically important and a major element in every kind of experience that you have, and not only as art, but in every other aspect of life. And the palette, for example, in painting, a simple rule is if you want a red painting, you have to strategically put a green in so that the eye, can come back. The idea that the eye immediately starts protecting itself, so it starts muting the red. So to have a patch of green is to get the eye so it can see the red, and the red still has an impact to it. So the eye has all these habits in a way. So if you do a painting, for example, and you have to do that, but if you do it in a garden, where suddenly you have sunlight and you have nature working for another. By the way, doing a garden was one of the best thing I ever did in my life. I'd never planted a plant when I took on the Getty, and it was a major learning curve. Major learning curve. I had done something. Well, I should come back to this little place for.
These are both good avenues. You can follow one and we can come back to the other.
Okay.
Yeah. I think hearing about the light, you were talking about the lights.
Where am I going at this moment?
I think when you were talking about the lights and color.
But anyway, I worked. I fell in love with the fluorescent light. I had 40 years ago looked at every single light source. I had an empty room. I coved all the corners. I knew that basically I wanted to deal with energy, not matter. So I didn't want to make things with stuff and materials and whatever. I really wanted to, in a way, capture light and the character and the quality of light and color. So in that process, doing a garden is like an incredibly, opportunity because, by the way, also one of the nicest audiences you'll ever eat in the world. They don't bust your ass. They all come up and want to hug you. Say, thank you for doing it. How it was wonderful that you actually did a garden and etc. The Getty was a wonderful experience that way. The art world, like I say, they're a little crueler sometimes. But because in a sense we have an entirely different rationale and history about what we think the role of art is, which, by the way, is something else we could talk about.
Could you continue talking a bit about the gels and the lights, though, Bob, as you were describing yesterday about
the
this?
one thing I might just mention is that some of the colors in here exist only because they're a light. They would not exist in a painting. They would just be mud, or in nature even they would be just dirt. But what you have in working with light is you have both refracted and emitted light. In other words, going back to the red-green problem, you can make a bright red tube, make it as strong as you want, and then put a very pale green around it at the last, which doesn't really change the red. But every time you see it from an angle or any place, the light off of it is green. The light that you see, in other words, what's emitted is red, what is refracted is green. So you start being able to make colors, like in here, some of these colors are colors you'll never get to see. I mean, there's some real subtle tubes in there that are, they knock me out. They're just, you want to eat them, take them home with you, go to bed with them. They're that good, so you might, that was one thing you say, they're the showier ones, but you might take a look at the seemingly less obvious ones.
And you were saying yesterday, Bob, that the color within the horticultural work that you've done has a similar quality in that you have this presence of light and the way in which the layering of colors creates an entirely new palette for you to have worked with. But nature, you can't beat nature. That's the supreme palette if you ever get to use it. And one of the things, I go back to what I was forgetting here, is that, in getting all the trees for here, I needed the tree for the parking lot. And very, very important. Like, what is that tree and how's it going to function and how many events does it have and how rich is it and what have you. And so that it, in a sense, does all the things that you need, both all over through the year. So at that time I had bought trees before from New Jersey, where all the really tree farms are, sort of down near Princeton, and they didn't have any trees. So I'm like in a panic, it's like, oh my God. What they said was that they had a lull in the business 10 years before, so everybody cut back on the number of trees they planted, and now all of a sudden there was a rush, and they had sold pretty much everything. And so I'm thinking, fate is like going to screw me here. And so I was going back and forth looking at all these, what was there, and they said, well, there is one guy you might want to go see, this one farm. He's such a prick that nobody likes him and and so he's liable to have some trees, So I went down and was as charming as I could be. I talked with him and talked about his business and his children and the whole thing, and I found him not such a bad guy at all, but he had trees. But the kind of trees I thought, for example, the most obvious thing is a cherry tree, a beautiful event, a powerful spring event, as it were, nice tree, good structure. The first thing is structure, whether or not the thing has a good structure, and then you start adding on the kind of events, and then you add on the color, and now you have, in a sense, something that becomes appropriate for the space. So anyway, he didn't have any of those kind of trees. So I'm just about ready to give up. I've been going down for 6-8 months. I went down one time in the dead of winter, and here these trees are with bright red berries on them. Amazingly beautiful, just like a veil of red, which the idea of in the winters, which are cruel here and can be very difficult here, that red berry in the winter is like
a godsend. I mean, it's just spectacular. So I'm like all ready to buy the trees, and he said, "You can't have them." And I said, "Like, why?" He said, "Because you're going to be in a public place, and these trees have thorns are like swords. It's called a hornbeam, but anyway, like swords." And I'm thinking, "Oh, what do you mean? You've got to be kidding me!" So I'm driving back, anguishing over it. I have an arborist that I've worked with for years on the Getty, and I called him up. I said, "Is it possible I could could I cut them off? I mean, would it wreck the tree, or will they grow back?" He said, "No, it's no problem." So I went and I cut all those thorns off those trees to a height where you can't get stuck when you get out of your car. And when that happens in the winter, let me tell you, I mean, it has a nice blossom in the spring, has a good structure to it, it's a nice tree, but it also has, at the worst time of that, up against the red brick of this building, dynamite. I mean, dynamite, you know. But it's that kind of an adventure, you know, looking for things and trying to find things and trying to find stuff that comes and goes, and it's a great game. It's the best game you can ever imagine having. There's no rules. There are no do's and don'ts in a way, in that sense, other than what it is you want to have happen or take place, or how you want to experience the situation, how rich, how, in a sense, fruitful it is. It's a good game. I got the best game in town. The only thing is, like just yesterday, I had an idea. I was asked to come to the Hirshhorn Museum, and the lady had found out, it was a young new lady, new curator, and she had found, just a couple of years ago, found out I was alive. And so she wanted to do a show of early work, which I have, you know, no interest in doing at all. I mean, I have nothing against it, but I have no interest in it. So but I went there and looked, and on my way out, I looked up, if you know the Hirshhorn, it's a kind of a brutal building, and it stands up off the ground. One part of it is actually a lobby. Then there are two open areas, and then there are two of the legs, and then a third open area. And I looked up at the ceiling of the open area, and it had these two lines in it everywhere. Just a detail was put on there, and all of a sudden I thought, wait a second, what happened if I put a piece of scrim on every one of those things all the way around? And so the whole Hirshhorn stood on like a feather. Or, you know, like if you turn some mushroom upside down, how it all goes out in every direction. Lovely, lovely thing, you know. So I've been really excited about it. But they came up yesterday after like 12 months of back and forth, and the engineers have said that in a 40-mile-an-hour wind, it will create a vortex which will spin around and ruin. And they're telling me that, I mean, this is just bullshit. They're telling me there are these blocks that this thing stands on that weigh 500 pounds apiece, and that this thing spans 6 of those blocks, and I would have them tied together at the top. But this 40-mile-an-hour wind is going to lift those blocks up out of there. Bullshit, you know. They're just. But the point is, I no longer have the project as of yesterday, you know, which was, yeah, exactly. That's the way I feel, you know. You don't get a great opportunity like that every day, you know.
Well,
so
we can start the petition here, Bob.
Oh yeah. Well, the thing about it is, you know, I found out very, very early that you know, the things. I had a project in Seattle, and at the last minute, I saw as-built drawings as opposed to the original drawings, and realized that this plaza could take no weight except in 9 spots, because there was a police garage below and there were 9 columns. And so essentially I redid the whole thing. It's called 9 Spaces, 9 Trees. So I put a tree, basically. I wanted to green up downtown Seattle. As green as Seattle is, downtown is not. And so I put a tree on top of each one of the columns, and then I built this space around them, a little bit like what's here, out of a fence material that's called non-climbable fence, and it has a small 3/4 inch aperture, so that when you see it from a distance, it's like a haze of color. so it works really beautifully. But the main reason why I use it is that the police chief then came down after and said, I don't want anything down here that people can hide behind in a jailbreak. It's hilarious, you know. I mean, it's so funny. But anyway, so the whole thing has based on the two things: 9 columns and no jailbreaks. But I had to get an engineer to come to talk about how much the columns could handle, and he gave me a thing, and we built the whole thing. And the day they had the opening, of course, it had a live load on it, a lot of people on there, which he either had not calculated, or he became afraid of his own calculations, and he wouldn't go up on there, you know. And from that day forward, I've never used an engineer again, except aeronautical engineers. I mean, they really engineer. They can't play that game. They got to have strength, weight, as opposed to endurance, and you know they can't double the weight just to be on the safe side. It has to be really engineered. So it's been a nice, pleasant. I love them as a group of people. They're spectacular. They really know what they're doing. Again, a part of the game. I mean, every project has its own set of problems and issues that have to be solved, and that's the fun part. You know, you go and look and look. In terms of the garden at the Getty, like I said, I'd never planted a plant, so I start looking. And I start looking and looking and looking and find out, first thing you find out that no matter where you look, if it's in January, you're going to see certain plants. And so you got to come back in spring, you got to come back in the summer, you got to come back in the fall to see what it does. Also, other plants suddenly. And you realize that almost every plant, if it's really doing well, it has its quality, has its beauty. And so you're able to understand how you weave this thing together over the seasons. But like, for example, in California, which I think is an interesting thing that we did, is that we have the only really winter garden in LA or maybe in Southern California, because we don't really have winters there. But the trees do lose their leaves and so on, so events do take place and what have you. And so I actually, all my large trees were deciduous, so the garden has suddenly on a scale a bit of a winter look. So instead of doing what people do in the summertime where you put a plant away in a greenhouse over the winter so that you can bring it out in the summer, I put plants in a greenhouse over the summer so I can bring them out in the winter. Ones that have beautiful colors, when they have no sticks, ones that have berries. I mean, there's a whole, so, you know, it's a fun game. It's an interesting game. But it's all done, you don't have to be that smart. All you have to do is pay attention. And so now what I would do is I take a truck up, I did for the first 6 years of have the garden being there, take a truck all the way up maybe to the Canadian border, rent rider trucks, build shelves in, and go to all the mom and pop nurseries. I mean, if you want dahlias, and you go to a big nursery, they got 6 varieties. You go to a mom and pop nursery who loves dahlias, they got 20. You know, and so you fill the truck up all the way down, and we brought them all the way down, and then we had a place in San Diego which was similar to the conditions at the Getty. You set the plants out, and you watch them. See what they do, whether they thrive. I have plants in that garden that in Washington, it's against the law to plant them because they're like, you know, they just take over everything. But here in Southern California, they're well-mannered and are quite beautiful. So, it's just, it's trial and error and paying attention and testing everything, as it were. And then once you get nature working for you, you're king. You know, you can't miss. I mean, it's the most powerful.
Maybe we can open it up in a moment, but I just wanted to ask Bob about the garden for Chinati, because this is a desert garden, and what type of
Chinati?
The one that's in process, right? Because there's a horticultural part of that as well.
Well, first of all, Chinati is the desert. and it doesn't really have much of a garden situation, although there's an incredible world of desert plants and trees and that. So I just bought my trees for there at a really beautiful nursery in northern Arizona, which hopefully has, in fact, I know the same kind of weather
Climate,
conditions, what have you. And I'm not going to plant plants per se in there. I've had my back pocket now for a long time some basalt columns. You can't mine basalt anywhere in the world, basically, but I have a place that I got some basalt, which I've been looking for a place to put this, because basalt columns are quite spectacular, and that's the reason you can't mine them, because where they are, they're classic landscape information, beautiful things to do. But so I'm actually going to, after like having these things for 11 years now, I got a spot where I think I can put them at the Chinati. I haven't even told it yet. I don't know if there's any spies here, but I think I'm going to do in that kind of desert situation, a little, sculpture built out of, and I have a guy, Laddie Flock. Laddie Flock can do anything with rock. I mean, the guy is, he's a rock man, And so I'm looking forward to hopefully doing that. I've got it all identified, and we've already put a deposit on them, and we're ready. I'm ready to go. I'm
looking forward. Bob, how do you feel about a couple of questions from the audience? I'm sure we have many.
Well, I don't know. Should
we delay it to the bagel
all
place?
Over the place. I don't even know why I talked about all that stuff, other than that's what I do. And it's not as it appears in a way, because basically nobody plays this game, and more people are beginning to now. But it's an activity which does not fit. On the whole, it does not fit in a gallery. It doesn't fit in the art world. It's not really saleable. It's each one's a unique one-off as such, and it's hard to find people that want to play with you, But it's a good game. I think I got the fat end of the stick.
So maybe we can say, if there's anyone who can't make it to the bagel shop tomorrow morning and who has a really good question, the pressure's on, then maybe we can have a couple of questions, Bob?
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
We've got a mic, so if you can raise your hand, if you dare. We've got brave lady here.
Kind of a quick statement, because I want to hear what you want to say. But I would imagine that you irritate a lot of professionals. I imagine that you irritate a lot of professionals. I'm sure, when you did the garden and the Getty, a lot of landscape architects and gardeners were probably pretty angry that you'd been given that as a first assignment. There may be architects who are angry and feel you're not really qualified. So I kind of get the feeling you may enjoy that, but just to ask you, what do you think about that, and how do so-called professionals respond to you?
Well, it's understandable that. Well, first of all, I have to tell you, the Getty was classic. Let's start even further back. The architect who had basically designed the entire building also designed the garden, and a guy by the name of Richard Meyer, and who actually is a quite good architect. And but they decided it was all too much of one piece, that it was just, and so a man asked me, who was sort of their guru, to come and take a look at the process. He then went immediately to Switzerland, so he left me with the sort of higher echelon of the Getty, and so we started having a kind of conference once every month in which I would bring in my drawings. Only Richard Meyer made it into a competition. He brought in his drawings. And he always had a guy whose responsibility was to look at my drawings right away and see the financial overreaches, which of course would immediately, name me as an amateur, not knowing what I'm doing. So and then he also had a guy whose job it was to come in and look at the logistics, that I was doing something that was going to be logistically out of reach and what have you. And then he had a third person who would be at each one of these meetings, which were held in his office, and he would, that was his intellectual apologist, and whose job it was to tell me how wonderful Richard Meyer's plan was, or tell them, and what a schlump I was. In the year of 1 year, everybody thought this was a horrible. I loved it. It was a great exercise and debate and what have you. I went through 4 intellectuals in a year. He'd hire and fire them in a way. And then when we started to plant the garden, then in the very beginning, the garden world, the critical world, came in and just said, you can't do this. I mean, like a winter garden and all that. So you can't do this, you can't do that. Which the assumption is that I hadn't done my homework. And the thing is, I had done my homework. I mean, I consulted, I talked to, I went everywhere, I looked at every plant, I went to every nursery within the entire state of California. I went 5 or 6 times a year, spent time in them. I looked at every single plant. I bought plants. I set them out. I spent time with them to see whether or not they... And the point is that after a period of time, it was very interesting that my palate, California, and especially Southern California, as much as you think of it as a garden spot, the nurseries are very limited, or were very limited, on what they had, because they basically raised what they knew they could sell. And then, of course, it was a hand-in-glove situation. So introducing new stuff or being able to do it, people didn't have a chance to see it. So the garden at the Getty became suddenly this place where they saw it. The plant worked. It was great. It was in their backyard. And so they actually literally changed the industry in Southern California. It was nice, because it wasn't a war. Basically, it turned out I'd done my homework, and that I'd actually, as it were, helped them in a way by enlarging the vocabulary of what you can grow down here. Like I was saying, the plant from Washington, which I use all the time, we can't even be grown in Washington. But down here, so every plant has its time and place. But every single plant we bought, we laid out and looked at for a year, 2 years, saw what they did, saw what happened, whether or not it, what happened in the winter, what happened in the fall, that sort of thing. So whether or not it really acclimatized itself, what have you. So I introduced, as it turned out, a larger vocabulary. They said you can't do what I was doing. Was foolish, that nobody garden would blah, 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 and all this other thing. But it turned out actually that was okay. Architects, I'm close enough to it that I can't think of myself as an architect, but I really have an appreciation for it. And Richard Meyer is a good architect. There are things he does very, very well. He blew it on the Getty. He had a great opportunity to deal with a large situation that had, but when he does a home, or he did a home, and originally there was a great book called 5 Architects, beautiful drawings, good architects. One of them just died, Michael Graves. Excuse me. I appreciate what they do. I would be happy to count myself among them, but I'm not. I'm playing a different game. But I've had very good luck in that, in a way. When I went to, like I say, the art world can be even crueler than the landscape world. They really can. I don't know if that answers your question.
That's great.
But yeah, it's always an issue. I mean, there are always critics, And sometimes you learn from them. Sometimes they essentially inform the project, help form it really in a way if you pay attention. They have good ideas. Frank Gehry, who I kind of grew up with as a friend, he was part of our Ferris Gallery gang, as it were. I give him a pass more than some because, for example, like Bilbao, the shitty museum, but they didn't ask for a museum. What they really wanted was a building which attracted tourism, and that's what they got. They got a great a great tourist attraction, and it's a terrible place to put art in, almost impossible in a way. But the other thing about Gary is that Gary used to take a piece of paper up and just throw it on the table. And he had these guys that worked for him, a couple of computer whizzes, and he'd say, "I want to build this building. I want it to be like this." And so they would have to take this wad of paper and start trying to engineer. And he essentially, like in Bilbao, for example, all that stuff was prefabbed, and everything essentially was assembled, and only two pieces didn't fit. I remember going to Australia and seeing the Opera House there, which was a fairly eccentric building, but they played hell building it. I mean, because they were doing it from a craft point of view, and it was just shapes that just were almost impossible to do. What Gary has introduced is a new vocabulary. Hell of a contribution.
So we'll just have one last question.
Quick sometimes.
Bob.
Okay.
Bob.
What?
From what you described, how you planned and studied for the gardens in California, it sounds very much like the approach you described in how you handled betting on horses, in terms of really studying, really balancing logic and reason and feeling, but studying the horses from the ground up, from the breeding in, from the different seasons at the different tracks, from the different furlongs. Would you just comment on that?
Well, I didn't have an income for a long, long time, naturally, and so the early years, I was a swing dancer. I loved to dance. Used to dance 7 nights a week. I had 4 or 5 partners at all times, going from different parts of the city, dancing in little Mickey Mouse contests, win $50 here, 25 there, come in third, get $15 consolation prize. But that's basically how I supported myself. Then I got interested in the horses, but not in a sense. I've been going to Vegas all my life. I like Vegas. I think it's a great place, a beautiful place, spectacular. There's a moment in Las Vegas that is spectacular. There's a moment when the sun is either coming up or going down, and you can't tell whether Vegas is lighting the sky or the sky is lighting Vegas. And I've got a hotel I stay in, and I lay in the bathtub and sit there for that moment every night and watch this magical light show. It's not one they planned, but it's spectacular. But so I used to go up as a young kid and to try poker. And those old guys who owned that table, I mean, I'd go at 2 in the morning, and the same guys would be there, and they owned that table. They used to just kick my ass, and they'd pat me on the head and send me home. But I got to playing with the horses. And it's for me, it was not a gambling game. It was like a 3-dimensional chess game, in which every piece of information counted. So I could get to the point. In other words, I could read a board, and I knew every trainer. I knew who bet their money, how they bet their money. I could see whether it arrived. Now, that didn't make me necessarily a winner per se. Let's just say I'm sitting in a box. The guy on the left of me owns horses. The guy on the right of me owns horses. The guy on the left of me is there every day and with his trainer. The guy on the right was every day with his trainer. This guy has a horse. his trainer shows up with a tie. Oh, that's interesting. The horse wins. The guy goes down and gets his picture taken. So as a handicapper, I say, when the trainer comes up with the tie, I got to take him seriously. Because today their money is possibly on the guy on the other side, exactly the same thing. This guy wore a tie 10 times and he wins only 3 times. This guy wears a tie and he wins 5 out of 5. I can handicap that too. In other words, now the way that comes, let's just say that you have a race that comes up and there's a one horse in the race who has who is a speed horse, likes to go to the front. He's been in 3 or 4 speed duels in a row where he can't get to the front, so he's been compromised. Now I look at a race and I think, God damn it, there's no speed in here. I mean, there either is no speed or all the speed is dull. They haven't shown their form. And now the guy here turns up with his tie, and now it doesn't mean he's going to win, but I guarantee he's going to show speed today, which means now my bet has been compromised. So it's just a little piece of handicapping is a great game. I mean, there's just more. I mean, chess is chess, but handicapping horses is just about as good. Only you got to put your money on the line every now and then, you know. So I did that for like 10 years. That's how I made a living. And I used to have a lady who kept all my records and all my notes and what have you. She'd call them for me in the morning on race day, and on that day I would go to the races. And I don't know if that answers it, but breeding like this, the Preakness. The Preakness just the other day. Here you've got this race, and 2 minutes before the race, there's this deluge of things. Now, a handicapper, the first thing he's got to do is immediately look back at the lineage of every horse in that race and see who has an inclination to run well in the mud. You know, there's you get 2 minutes of calculation, and then you only got an 8-horse field, and you realize that the thing is basically upset. So you make one assumption is, let's say the winner is going to be a winner, and that the other 7 horses now. So now you can put 3 or 4 shots and long shots into hook him up with a winner. You got a shot because the race is totally upside down. Any horse could win now. I don't know if that's whether or not a good example, but that's it's a great game. I mean, it's so complex. There's nothing more complex, and it's a human thing. So it's always moving, changing, altering, much more complex than chess in a way. So yeah, I don't play the horses anymore because it's a kind of a full-time job, you know. So I don't do it, but I love doing it, and it's how I made a living because I didn't make any money as an artist for the first 40 years. I didn't make any money teaching because I used to do it for free.
Bob, I think I'm aware that we have to close a little bit early today, and it's very important.
Like that.
So I hope you've all got some time now to walk around. I think if I'm right, Maria, we close at 4 today. Is it? Yeah. So I wanted to make sure that you've got a good half hour at least to move around and see the piece. Thank you so much, Bob. It was great.
Yeah.